I'm interested to get both of your takes on this. So let's say, example, both Michigan and Ohio State are undefeated going into the game. And let's say just with the game and conference championship, they split. They each go 1 for 1. How do you both think that plays for when you talk about playoff, right? Because a lot of people, when you look at just this past season with the conference championship of Alabama, Georgia, well, no one wanted to see them play again in the first. Well, they didn't play again in the first round, but then played again in the national championship. So that kind of comes into play a little bit as well as, well, how do you see it? Would we rather see them play, almost a third straight game, or do you split them essentially and put them on different quote unquote ends of the bracket so they could potentially, the third time be in the national championship? So I'm not quite sure. Steve, what do you think if they split, right? So let's say Michigan wins the game, Ohio State wins the conference championship, in let's say it's clear they are two of the best four teams. How do you think that would kind of play out when it comes to the seeding for the college football playoff?
Well, I thought last year that the priority was splitting up Alabama and Georgia after that SEC championship game, where it didn't really matter where you seeded Michigan and Cincinnati as long as you were giving one of them Michigan and the other one Cincinnati. So, and both of those teams proved that they belonged in that national championship game, and they won those games in convincing fashion. So I think that it would be preferred to split them up rather than, I guess, objectively rank 1 through 4 just for the betterment of the playoff and betterment of the product, I would say. So, and also a lot of times there's not a far distance between a 2 and 3 or a 3 and 4. So some of those rankings can be interchangeable a lot of times. So I think if in the rare scenario where that would happen, I would split them up. But another thing to factor in, I doubt this would ever happen with Michigan, Ohio State, given the tradition of the game and all of that. But the Big 12, when they implemented their conference championship game in 2017, one of the first things they did, they took Bedlam off the final week of the season because Bedlam in the mid-2010s was basically a de facto Big 12 championship game every single year. So they didn't want Bedlam repeating itself on the following week. Although they finally moved it back to the final week last season after Oklahoma State struggled to qualify for the Big 12 championship game. And that was almost our Big 12 championship game last year again, too. So they experimented with moving Bedlam away so we won't get it into back-to-back weeks so often. I don't think the Big 10 would do that with Michigan and Ohio State, but if they did scrap divisions, it would be interesting to see how often we would get the same game in back-to-back weeks, because that's not ideal to have that occur.
Yep. Mark, what do you think would happen in that situation, or what are your thoughts on it?
So we're looking at a three-peat. We're looking at 3 matchups
in one season. So not the Alabama Clemson of part 2 and 3. We're talking one football season.
Yeah, so right now in the SEC with Georgia and Alabama only playing once every 6 years or 7 years, the likelihood of that happening is minuscule. But if the SEC goes in this direction with the balance of power being what it is in college football, with those two being at the top of the line, my goodness, they're going to be looking at even a greater likelihood of that happening, depending on how they set up these pods. So I guess not. You've got Ohio State and Michigan playing every year. You would think Alabama and Michigan are or Alabama and Georgia are going to be split up. But yeah, you threw out the scenario, Des, of undefeated Ohio State and Michigan teams going into the game. So you're looking at 13-1, or you're looking at an undefeated winner. They go on to win the Big Ten championship, and a one-loss loser that's still considered one of the best teams in the country, and they're both in the playoff. Yeah. I would think that the powers that be are working through each season in the past to say, okay, we came up with this structure, this model. Let's run it through 2019, 18, 17, 16, 15, 14, and see what we get. Even though the schedules are going to be slightly different, still the best teams are going to win the games. But to run that through and see how that would play out. Now, Michigan hasn't been nearly as good. They've been good, but not nearly as good as they were this past season. So that Ohio State-Michigan situation, I don't think would have come up too much. But if Michigan continues to trend up, then I think it's an issue. I think it's something that needs to be thought through.
What do you think so coming from an Ohio State perspective, what would you think, like Steve kind of mentioned, what would you think of potentially moving the game off of the kind of the cornerstone week that it's on right now? What would be your thoughts on that?
I've been watching this game since 1977. I'm dating myself. Sorry. Yeah, that hurts to say, but you guys can't even relate to 1977. But, man, I just can't imagine Ohio State and Michigan not playing the last, like it being mid-October, they play, and then they continue on with the season on their merry way. It's just, man, it's inbred in me that that's the culmination of the season.
I would imagine. I'm curious to see what our listeners think about that. Let us know what you would think if they moved the game from the, what is that, Saturday after Thanksgiving. It basically always is rivalry weekend. Steve, what would be your thoughts on that if they did? Like you said, I mean, the blueprint is there, right? So the Big 12 did that with one of their matchups. Now, I guess some would argue that Oklahoma-Texas would be potentially a bigger rivalry than Oklahoma State, but nonetheless still a pretty big rivalry that they moved with the change of the, getting rid of division. So if this were to come down, do you think that would be, potential to move the game?
Real quick before Steve goes, just want to finish my thought because this just popped into my head. When they went to the Legends and Leaders, so the Big Ten was obviously just one conference, one standing. Then they added the championship game in 2011. They split into the Legends and Leaders. Well, they determined that they didn't mind separating Ohio State and Michigan in separate divisions, still playing the final game of the season and risking playing a rematch the next week. So it didn't last long. That concept only lasted for 3 seasons before they said, okay, people don't understand this. We're getting made fun of. Let's just go with East and West. Who in the world knows what we're talking about? Legends and Leaders. And there was all this crisscross geography that was like, why are they there? Wisconsin's and Ohio State, and they're all over the place. Nobody understood it. And so they only went with that for 3 years. But at the outset, they certainly put that together knowing, okay, we're going to have Ohio State and Michigan continue their series last weekend of the season. Then they could rematch in the championship game.
Perfect. Steve, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say where I would prefer Michigan Ohio State as a noon game on rivalry weekend every single year. But
there you go.
We know that almost nothing is that sacred anymore in college football. Early 2010s. Okay, I've been to a backyard brawl before. That might have been the most underrated rivalry in college football. It was just a staple of rivalry week. Pitt and West Virginia, those fan bases hate each other like to a magnitude that you wouldn't understand. They just scrapped it. Texas A&M. I'm a Texas alum. My brother went to Texas A&M. I know that rivalry so well. That is bigger than any Texas rivalry currently, and that's bigger than any Texas A&M rivalry currently. We don't even know if they're ever going to play again. So anything can happen with a rivalry is just losing that esteem. It's
Absolutely.
Not going to happen, Ohio State, but moving the game wouldn't be the end all for that.
Yeah. They're certainly going to keep the game. It was the highest rated game in college football last year. Yeah. And typically, even when they're not that good, it's one of the 2 or 3 highest. It's just the gap between that game's ratings, and I know there were special circumstances with Michigan's surge, but it had like a 40% larger audience than the second highest rated game of the season. So yeah, they're going to protect it. But to Steve's point, that's been the one game that there's obviously a push typically to move the best games to night before this big noon kickoff initiative by Fox. The general thinking was, okay, these two teams are better than expected. They're 7-0, 7-0, or somebody's jumped up. We're going to move this game to nighttime. But that's one game that they've preserved at noon, with one exception. 2006, they played at 3:30. And they were both undefeated in 1 and 2 in the country, and that's one of the reasons they moved it to 3:30. But I think they quickly determined it doesn't matter when they play. People are going to watch anyway. So we might as well keep tradition. And there was a lot of backlash to messing with tradition. So,
yeah, I mean, I like the noon kick. I like it as far as that day. I like the noon kick. But I took a quick look at the top rated or the most watched football games last year. And this is from 247sports.com. Obviously, the game was number 1. Based on this article I just looked at real quick, audience was 15.9 million. The next highest game was the Iron Bowl, Alabama-Auburn, was 10.4 million. So that, I mean, that is a lot. That's a huge difference. I mean, that's essentially what, 50% more. I mean, that's huge. That's huge. And then Michigan had the third highest game with Michigan State, 9.3 million. So yeah, I like keeping the game where it is and have the powers that be figure out what the, you kind of cross that bridge when you get there. I mean, I would think it probably wouldn't happen, like you mentioned, Mark, 4 out of 10 years, but I'm not sure if Michigan continues the surge that they're currently on, that we've seen in the past 12 months, and Ohio State keeps on their standard. Maybe we are cruising for that for, the foreseeable future. But the thing that I look at is Michigan, as far as their out of conference scheduling, having tougher teams on the docket. I think that potentially could change it. I haven't looked up, Ohio State, but I know they played obviously Oregon here recently, Texas. So, maybe it's one of those things that as these teams start to put heavier and heavier teams on the schedule, that maybe that's a lot less likely that we really think that will be.
Although it's a conference only determination of who those 1 and 2 seeds are. So regardless of their out of conference performance.
Yeah. But in that so
you're talking about the playoff going
right.
To the playoff.
Yeah. So
Gotcha.
so essentially having that three-peat.
Okay.
Now you still might get a back-to-back, which I feel like people can live with. It's just another shot at watching the rivalry game. Both of those fan bases travel really well. So, Indianapolis would be just maize in scarlet, and I think it'd be awesome.
The fan base that's going to be annoyed in any given year is the one that didn't need to win that game to get to the Big Ten championship game. And they're like, oh, we got to beat them again, versus the team that is just, okay, we have to win this game to get to the Big Ten championship game. So we will gladly have to play them again, because otherwise, if we lose, we're out.
Yeah. Wouldn't that be weird if Ohio State and Michigan be like the first conference game, be like in week 3 or something, like end of September? It just would be odd. I don't know. I'd be good with that. I'm not quite sure. Not sure. I feel like it would take away a little bit, because you have the banter that goes by all season. When both teams, were to beat Michigan State, well, we beat them by 20, you only beat them by 10, so we're better. You'll see at the end of so it would take away from that. So it'll be interesting to see what happens, but I don't think that I think with the Big Ten and their history, I think they'd be hard pressed to move that game.
And one of the favorite catchphrases of odds makers is a letdown game. Now, you talk about the ultimate letdown game. If Michigan would have beaten Ohio State like in week 10 and still had somebody else to play the next week like they did last year, they slay the giant and they still have to play Maryland the next week.
Iowa, road game at Iowa.
Yes. Yeah, give them something like that. Yeah, something tricky. Yeah, go to Wisconsin the next week. Exactly.